The wind, a mournful dirge through the skeletal branches of Harrison Woods, whispered secrets of decay and forgotten things, its chill breath seeping into the very marrow of anyone unfortunate enough to linger. Late spring hadn't yet coaxed full life back to the canopy. The air clung cold and dry, dusky light, filtering through trees as gaunt as famine victims, their limbs intertwined like arthritic fingers against a pale sky. The forest floor, a treacherous carpet of moss-slicked roots and perpetually damp earth, was a place deliberately unvisited, a repository of secrets best left undisturbed. Emily Grace, 12 years spent wrestling with a world that had unceremoniously discarded her, dragged a protesting rusted shopping cart, its wheels screeching a lament against the uneven ground. Her hair, a matted tapestry of dirt twigs, and innate resilience-framed eyes that had witnessed far too much emptiness for their tender age. Torn sleeves, remnants of some forgotten charity, flapped around thin arms that bore the scratches and bruises of her existence. Beneath a tattered plastic sheet, a pitifully thin barrier against the elements, lay her meager hoard, a battered, reused plastic water bottle, often more empty than full. Scavenging tools, a bent screwdriver, a pair of pliers with one grip missing. Carefully wrapped in a scrap of faded denim. A frayed raincoat that doubled as her blanket against the biting night air. And a one-eyed teddy bear, its fur worn smooth by countless anxious clutches, the sole tangible relic of a forgotten orphanage. The cart's metallic belly rumbled with crushed aluminum cans, snippets of scavenged copper wire, and a collection of broken electronics, pitiful trophies from her daily relentless hunt for survival. Hunger, a constant gnawing companion. Cold and unwelcome intruder. The pervasive, soul-crushing dread of utter invisibility. These were her constant, unwelcome adversaries. Today's spoils were exceptionally dishearteningly poor. A few more rusted metal bits, a half-shattered glass jar with no discernible purpose. She was hurrying the early cruel bite of an unseasonable winter chill nipping through her rags, a harbinger of the harsher seasons to come towards her makeshift lean-to, woven from discarded tarps, fallen branches, and sheer desperation. Suddenly, she stopped, her head cocked. A subtle tremor, a palpable wrongness in the earth beneath her worn-out sneakers, a discord in the forest's somber symphony. Emily crouched, a feral alertness sharpening her already keen features. Her small hand pressed against the damp ground, then her ear. Thump, thump. Faint, rhythmic, undeniably metallic. Not the wind sighing through the pines. Not the settling of gravel deep within the earth. This was different. This was contained. Instinct, her truest and most reliable teacher in a life devoid of formal instruction, screamed a silent, urgent alarm. With bare hands already chapped raw and grimed with the forest floor, she clawed at the soil. Earth-tangled roots and layers of thick moss yielded slowly to her desperate efforts. Fingernails splintered, drawing thin trickles of blood that bloomed dark against the grime, the sting a dull counterpoint to her rising anticipation. Then wood. A crudely constructed panel, a single rusted hinge clinging precariously, and most curiously, a crudely fashioned aluminum air vent, clearly in addition to whatever lay beneath. She strained her small body, trembling with the effort, prying it open with a piece of sharp-edged metal she'd scavenged. A wave of thick, cloying heat, heavy with the oppressive stench of mildew, trapped breath and despair so profound it seemed to have rotted into the very molecules of the air, assaulted her. Emily recoiled, gasping, her eyes watering. Then she froze, every muscle tensed. Her face, already pale from hunger and exposure, bleached to a ghostly, almost translucent white. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, locked onto the shadowed abyss she had uncovered. Terror, cold, sharp, and absolute, seized her, a primal scream trapped in her lungs, her small body rooted to the spot, as if the forest itself had reached out with icy tendrils to hold her captive before this ghastly revelation. Her throat constricted, Her heart thrashed against her ribs, a wild, panicked bird caged within her chest. She couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, couldn't run. Inside the cramped coffin-like space, illuminated by the weak, filtered light from above, lay a man. His eyes were half open, vacant, staring at nothing. His wrists were bound tight, cinched cruelly, with industrial-grade nylon zip ties and the plastic biting into his skin. He wore a rumpled, once expensive light gray suit, its collar stained with dried, rust-colored blood. His lips were cracked and peeling, his skin waxy and pale, stretched taut over sharp cheekbones. But his chest, almost imperceptibly at first, then with a shuddering intake of air, rose and fell. He was alive. The man's gaze, initially unfocused and distant, snagged on her small, silhouetted figure against the opening. It wasn't the look of someone already surrendered to death. It was the faint, dying ember of a life brutally extinguished, but not yet cold, a flicker of consciousness in the overwhelming darkness. Water, he rasped the sound, like dry leaves skittering across cold stone, a mere breath of a word. Emily jolted from her paralysis. By that fragile plea, fumbled in her cart for her grimy water bottle. With trembling hands, she uncapped it and held it to his lips. He drank in slow, agonizingly desperate gulps, the water spilling down his chin, his trembling hand brushing her wrist as he tried to guide the bottle. For a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, awareness, raw and potent emotion flickered in the depths of his eyes. Gratitude, fear, disbelief. "I don't know who you are," Emily whispered, her voice barely more than the soughing wind through the desolate trees, yet firm with an unconscious resolve. "But if you're still alive, I'm not letting you die here." Summoning a strength she didn't know she possessed, fueled by a potent mixture of shock and an ingrained empathy born of her own suffering, Emily hauled the man limp as a broken doll from the suffocating confines of his premature grave. The effort was immense, his dead weight a burden on her undernourished frame. But she persisted, grunting with exertion, until he lay on the damp earth beside the hole. She then laid him gently on her worn raincoat, the thin material a pitiful barrier against the cold ground. The meager sunlight offered little physical warmth, but a different, more profound kind of heat kindled between them in that desolate clearing. The shared primal spark of survival. Unbeknownst to her, this child, forgotten and discarded by the world, had just rescued Henry Caldwell Harrison's most influential and now most terrifyingly vulnerable man. In that single desperate act of untaught compassion, she had not only saved a life, but unknowingly tugged at a filament woven deep into the tangled fabric of her own stolen past. A manhunt years in the subtle, insidious making was about to ignite with the ferocity of a wildfire. She didn't ask why he was there who had committed such a monstrous act. In the bleak, unforgiving landscape of the abandoned survival was the only creed, and the only question that mattered was, "Are you breathing?" His breathing, shallow and ragged, punctuated by hitched gasps, nevertheless never ceased. As dusk began to creep through the trees, casting long, eerie shadows, Emily lit a small branch, the flickering flame, a defiant pinprick of light in the gathering gloom, casting dancing, distorted shapes on the surrounding trees. She chafed his cold, unresponsive hands, then wrapped her own thin, torn jacket more securely around his thin legs, reserving the raincoat as his primary covering. In the unsteady firelight, a strange, inexplicable sense of kinship stirred within her. An echo, a resonance she couldn't name, like a half-remembered song. A dry, racking cough tore from his chest, shaking his frail frame. He tried to sit, his head lolling weakly. "Daylight." He murmured, his voice thick and raw, blinking painfully against the filtered glare that seemed to stab at his unaccustomed eyes. Emily, anticipating his chill, draped her own pitifully thin jacket over his shoulders. He looked at her, then truly saw her for the first time, this small, fierce child of the shadows, who had pulled him back from the brink. His eyes, moments before pleading and vacant, now held a gathering storm. The banked fury of a king dethroned, clinging desperately to the shredded remnants of his power and his humanity. "What's your name?" His voice, though weak and trembling, held an unmistakable timbre of ingrained authority. "Emily." "Just Emily," she replied, her voice soft but steady. He nodded slowly, as if etching her name into the fractured shards of his memory. "And who are you?" She ventured, her own fear warring with a desperate curiosity. "Why were you buried like that?" A chilling silence descended, broken only by the mournful whisper of the wind through the branches. Then, with a voice slowly regaining a sliver of its former resonance, a voice that once commanded boardrooms and swayed fortunes, he answered, "My name is Henry Caldwell." Emily stiffened. The name resonated deep within her, a half-forgotten headline from a discarded newspaper, a whispered local legend of wealth and power. A faint, utterly mirthless smile touched his cracked lips. "I used to be significant," he said, the words laced with a profound irony. "Real estate philanthropy. The man who built homes for the poor and an empire for himself, the papers once called me. I shunned the spotlight, preferred the shadows. Perhaps that made me easier to erase." His eyes, clouded with a pain that transcended the physical, stared into a past only he could see. That night, I had just returned from a scholarship fund meeting. Victoria, my wife. She was in the kitchen. She poured me a glass of red wine. It tasted sweet at first. He paused, a tremor running through his body as if reliving the moment. Then there was this sharp, incapacitating pain. My neck. The world spun into a nauseating vortex. He closed his eyes, his breath catching. Before I blacked out, completely helpless, I heard her whisper, her voice a chilling caress against my ear. "Henry, my love, our kind of love, doesn't need an audience. I'm going to keep you. Forever." He shuddered violently. I woke in that box, tied, an IV drip snaking into my arm, keeping me just alive enough. Masked figures. They'd check my pulse, leave food, water, then disappear. Not a word. Ever. There was a clock on the wall inside, always counting down. Not tracking time, I realized, with dawning horror, but tracking how much of my life, my stolen life, was left. He held up a wrist, gesturing towards the angry red scar that circled it. The zip ties were so tight. Emily swallowed hard, a knot of shared terror and burgeoning anger forming in her chest. "They buried you alive?" she asked, her voice barely audible. A dry, bitter laugh, like the sound of old ashes falling apart, escaped him. Oh, they wanted more than that. They wanted me to exist in torment, to be a silent, helpless witness to my own slow, agonizing demise. The ultimate, unending torture. Emily reached for her threadbare raincoat, the one that had been his bed, and pulled it tighter around him, an instinctive gesture of protection. A shared desolation, an unspoken kinship of the forgotten and the betrayed, was forged in that desolate, fire-lit clearing. That day, a silent pact was made between the discarded child and the entombed millionaire. The quest to reclaim Henry Caldwell's stolen life, and with it, the dignity so brutally ripped from him, had begun. And with it, unknowingly, Emily Grace's perilous journey towards a past violently stolen from her before she ever had a chance to know it. As dusk bled into the deeper, more threatening gloom of the woods, bringing with it a damp, penetrating chill that seeped into their bones, Henry's breathing remained shallow, his body racked by intermittent, uncontrollable shivers, despite Emily's best efforts. Fear, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, began to prickle at Emily's skin. He needed more help than she could provide, more than this forsaken wood could offer. Suddenly, Henry gasped, his eyes previously dull with pain, now wide with a new, more immediate terror. "They'll come back." He choked out his voice, a strangled whisper. "They'll know I'm gone from that damned box." "Who?" Emily asked, her own small voice laced with a dawning understanding of the true peril they faced. "Victoria. Silas Drake, her jackal, her enforcer. They wouldn't just leave my disappearance to chance. They'd have contingency plans." He struggled to sit up his gaze, darting frantically into the deepening gloom that pressed in around them, transforming familiar trees into menacing, shadowy figures. "We have to move. Now, before they find us here." A twig snapped in the near distance, the sound unnaturally loud in the charged silence. Emily's blood ran cold. Instinct honed by years of navigating the precarious dangers of the street screamed a high-pitched internal alarm. "This way." She hissed, her decision instantaneous, grabbing the handle of her rusted shopping cart. It was a clumsy, desperate plan, born of necessity. But Henry was far too weak to walk any significant distance. With immense straining effort, she helped him clamber into the cart, a grotesque and undignified chariot, piling her meager belongings around him as best she could for padding and concealment. The sounds grew closer. The distinct heavy crunch of boots on dry leaves muffled urgent voices, cutting through the stillness. "Quickly, girl, they're almost upon us." Henry urged, his voice tight with a potent cocktail of fear and rising panic. Emily pulled her underdeveloped muscles screaming in protest, the cart lurching precariously over exposed roots and loose rocks, each jolt eliciting a pained groan from Henry. Behind them, the sharp, cutting beams of powerful flashlights sliced through the trees, searching, probing. "There I see movement over there by the fallen oak." A gruff, unseen voice called out alarmingly close. A surge of pure, undiluted adrenaline coursed through Emily. She veered sharply off the barely discernible deer path they had been following, plunging deeper into the untamed, unforgiving heart of the forest. The shopping cart, a cumbersome anchor in their flight. Low-hanging branches clawed at her face, and arms, unseen roots, threatened to trip her at every step. Henry, though weak, held on tight, his face a mask of grim determination. The pursuit was relentless, systematic. These were not casual searchers. They were hunters skilled in closing in with terrifying speed. A bullet whined past Emily's ear, with a sound like an angry hornet thudding sickeningly into a tree trunk just inches from her head. She cried out, a small, involuntary gasp of terror, stumbling. But somehow she didn't stop. Henry, with a surprising surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, grabbed a thick, broken branch from the bottom of the cart. "If they catch us," he panted, his eyes wild and fierce, "they won't take us alive a second time." They burst suddenly into a small natural clearing, a sheer unscalable rock face looming on one side, a dense, impenetrable thicket of thorny bushes on the other. Trapped. It was a dead end. Two men, large and menacing, their features obscured by the deep shadows, and low-pulled knit caps emerged from the trees, guns leveled, their movements fluid and practiced. Silas Drake was not with them, but these were clearly his men, bearing the same cold, professional aura. "Well, well, look what the cat dragged in." One of them sneered, his voice dripping with malicious satisfaction. The old man decided to take a little unscheduled walk, and he found himself a little helper, didn't he? "Give him to us, girl." The other said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, utterly deadly. "And we might just let you run along." Might. Emily stood defiant, a small, trembling but fierce figure positioning herself resolutely between them and the helpless Henry in the cart. "You'll have to go through me," she declared, her voice surprisingly steady. Henry from the cart let out a weak, wheezing laugh. Spirited, isn't she? Almost makes one feel a bit protected. He raised the broken branch, a pathetically futile weapon against their firearms, but a gesture of defiance nonetheless. One of the men advanced, his movements predatory. Just as he lunged towards Emily, a cacophony erupted in the distance. Sirens faint at first, then growing steadily louder, cutting through the night air. The men exchanged alarmed, uncertain glances. "Cops! How in the hell could they know?" one muttered, clearly rattled. "Doesn't matter. Grab him. We can't leave empty-handed. Drake will have our hides." The other snapped, though his resolve seemed to waver. But the approaching sirens, a sheer fluke of some other distant, unrelated emergency, perhaps gave them critical pause. One hesitated, then snarled in frustration, "Forget it. Drake will have to handle this another way. We can't risk being caught here with this." They melted back into the dense woods as quickly and silently as they had appeared, shadows swallowed by shadows. Emily sagged against the cold metal of the cart, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Henry coughed, a hand pressed tightly to his chest. That was far too close. He managed his voice hoarse. He looked at her, a new profound respect dawning in his weary eyes. "You saved me again, Emily. Your courage, it's remarkable." The forest, moments before a terrifying death trap, was now silent, save for their ragged breathing and the receding wail of the distant sirens. But the reprieve felt temporary, fragile like a gossamer thread about to snap. The hunters would be back. They knew now that Henry was mobile and he had an ally. Knowing the woods were no longer a sanctuary, however precarious, Emily guided the lurching cart towards the distant faint glow that marked the edge of town as the first pale fingers of dawn began to streak the eastern sky. Each step was a gamble, each shadow a potential threat. They found precarious temporary shelter in an abandoned, dilapidated supply shed behind an old, long-closed-down barbershop on 9th Street. The wooden door was broken, hanging askew on one hinge, but it offered a modicum of concealment. Inside, it was cold, damp, and smelled of decay and forgotten things, but a single bare bulb miraculously still worked when Emily gingerly flipped the rusty switch. She laid Henry on a raincoat, covering him with her own tattered jacket. Where in God's name did you learn all this?" Henry asked, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and concern as he watched her expertly strip insulation from a piece of wire she'd found part of a broken fan, preparing to try and boil a small tin of water over a tiny controlled flame she'd coaxed from hoarded matches and dry tinder. Her makeshift gloves, fashioned from layers of scavenged cloth, protected her small hands from the heat. "When no one helps you, you learn," Emily said simply, her tone devoid of self-pity. Then, her voice dropping to a near whisper, she added, "They tried to grab me before. Lots of times. When I was sleeping under the bridge. The cops, they didn't believe me. Said I was making it up for attention." She paused, a flicker of a dark memory crossing her face. "One time, a woman, fancy car, all black blonde hair pulled back tight. I couldn't see her face clearly, it was dark, but I think they know I'm alive. The ones who took you. The ones who buried you." A terrible, sickening premonition coiled in Henry's gut. This child wasn't just a random savior. She was somehow entangled in the web of Victoria's treachery, a loose thread Victoria would undoubtedly try to snip. The following morning, after a fitful, fever-racked night for Henry, Emily, leaving him hidden and as comfortable as possible, sought out the only grocery store in their part of town that opened before the sun was fully risen. Mrs. Mildred Harper, 60-something, with sharp assessing eyes that missed little but held an underlying current of kindness, was at the counter ringing up cough drops for an elderly man. When he left, Emily approached, pulling out a beat-up, non-functional phone, its screen a spiderweb of cracks. It held a single short video clip. "I don't have any internet or service, just this. Please, you have to watch." Mildred, her expression initially cautious, leaned in, her gaze fixing on the tiny damaged screen. A gaunt, disheveled Henry Caldwell stared directly into the camera, his voice hoarse but imbued with a desperate urgency. "My name is Henry Caldwell. If you're seeing this, Victoria Langford is..." The screen abruptly went black. "Oh my God," Mildred whispered, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and dawning comprehension. "Henry? Henry Caldwell. He used to send me handwritten letters, can you imagine? $50,000, it was back in 2013. Said it was just to keep your little store from going dark during the recession," he wrote. "I never met him in person, never knew what he looked like, but I heard about him all the time. He's that millionaire who helped people quietly donated to small towns fix the church roof. I was one of them." She reached for the old-fashioned landline phone behind the counter, her hand surprisingly steady. "Felicia, it's Mildred. You need to get to town. Right now. It's about Henry Caldwell." On the other end of the line, in the small, bustling free clinic on the outskirts of Harrison, Dr. Felicia Tran, whose entire medical education had been funded by a generous, anonymous scholarship created by Henry Caldwell, dropped her pen mid-sentence on a patient file. Henry Caldwell. The name was a lifeline, a debt of gratitude she could never fully repay. The clinic itself, a sanctuary for those too poor to afford care elsewhere, was another of his quiet philanthropies. News that he was alive held captive. It couldn't be a hoax, not from Mildred. If it was true, Felicia knew with absolute certainty she couldn't stay silent. She owed him everything. Meanwhile, in her secluded, opulent estate on the other side of the county line, Victoria Langford, flawlessly attired, even at this early hour, watched the same grainy video clip on a secure, encrypted tablet, her face an unreadable mask of porcelain perfection. Did he say anything else of substance? She asked, her voice as cold and smooth as polished marble, addressing Silas Drake, her attorney, unofficial lover, and the meticulous cleaner of all her unpleasant messes. Silas, an imposing figure, whose stillness often spoke more than words, shook his head. The clip cuts off abruptly. Source appears to be an untraceable burner phone activated briefly in town, then discarded. It could be the girl he was last seen with. "Find her, Victoria," commanded her voice, dropping to a near-silent, infinitely more dangerous whisper. "Trace the video, however tenuous the link. Wipe everything, Silas, every trace. And this time," her eyes the color of Arctic ice locked with his, "this time don't let her live. He was mine to keep, Silas, mine. She's interfering with what belongs to me. And no one takes what's mine." A flicker of something dark, possessive, and terrifyingly proprietary crossed her perfectly composed features. Lucinda Bell, a former socialite whose star had dimmed considerably after Henry's charitable foundation had publicly denied her fraudulent funding application, cackled with malicious glee as her hastily written venomous online smear piece, provocatively titled "Henry Caldwell Philanthropist" or "Predator in Plain Sight," gained traction across local forums and gossip sites. Revenge, she mused, sipping her morning champagne, was a dish best served cold, viral, and utterly devastating. Julian Blake, a struggling freelance photographer, received an anonymous, menacing call later that day. "Still have those interesting photos from 6 years ago, Blake? The ones of Caldwell looking agitated near the Harrison woods just days before he disappeared. Hand them over. Quietly. Or you'll lose a lot more than your camera this time." Chills cold and greasy ran down Julian's spine. His unexplained, near-fatal car crash all those years ago, the one that had totaled his car and his nerves suddenly made a terrifying, sickening kind of sense. Deputy Carl Bridges' feet kicked up on his cluttered desk at the sheriff's station, and the local news blaring on the small TV in the corner barely registered Emily's breathless, dirt-smudged arrival. "Sir, please, someone was buried. In the woods." His name is Henry Caldwell. He's alive. I pulled him out. Carl eyed her tattered clothes, her smudged face, the desperation in her eyes. No adult in sight. You got any paperwork, kid? Any guardian with you? He waved a dismissive, impatient hand when she shook her head. Look, maybe he's senile and wandered off. Or maybe you're just imagining stuff. Lots of folks get turned around in those woods. Go on home, sweetheart. Don't stir up trouble where there ain't none. Emily left a fresh, bitter crack forming in her young, already bruised heart. The casual indifference of a man sworn to protect was a crueler blow than any physical hardship. 2 days later, a breaking news ticker flashed across the bottom of that same TV screen. Miracle or hoax missing millionaire Henry Caldwell, presumed dead for years, reportedly found alive in Harrison Woods. Carl's face went chalky pale. The anonymous, suspiciously thick envelope filled with cash that had mysteriously appeared in his desk drawer the previous afternoon, after he dismissed that stray kid, suddenly felt like a ticking bomb heavy with implications he didn't want to face. Back in the cramped, stifling confines of the abandoned shed, Henry was consumed by a raging fever. Emily knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that they couldn't stay there. His labored breathing was a constant, grim reminder of their precarious situation. That night, as she tended to him, sponging his forehead with a damp rag, a new, more sinister sound intruded upon the night's uneasy quiet. The soft, deliberate crunch of gravel outside, then a metallic scraping at the flimsy, rotting shed door. Emily. Henry whispered, his eyes glazed with fever, now wide with a fresh wave of fear. The door creaked open with agonizing slowness, and 2 shadowy figures loomed in the opening, their silhouettes menacing against the faint moonlight. These were not the rough thugs from the woods. These men were different, and their movements more precise, more professional. One held a canister, its outline vaguely familiar and deeply unsettling. He's in here just like Drake said. One of the figures hissed, his voice low and conspiratorial. Drake said, make it look like an accident. Vagrants, a discarded cigarette, a tragic fire. Before Emily could scream, a sharp, acrid chemical smell filled the small enclosed space. Gasoline. No. Emily scrambled instinctively, trying to shield Henry's prone form with her own small body. One man callously kicked aside their meager pile of belongings, sloshing liquid from the canister onto the dry wooden floorboards and a pile of old newspapers in the corner. The other fumbled with a lighter, and the metallic click unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Henry, with a surge of adrenaline that belied his weakened state, yelled, "Run, Emily, get out of here, save yourself." The lighter sparked. Flames erupted near the doorway, with a terrifying whoosh, greedily licking at the dry, flammable wood of the old shed walls. Smoke, thick, black, and acrid, billowed instantly, choking them, stinging their eyes. Emily coughed, her eyes, stinging tears streaming down her face. Panic, raw and clawing, threatened to overwhelm her. She grabbed Henry's arm, pulling with all her might. "We have to go. We have to get out." The heat was already intense, searing their skin. The crackle and roar of the rapidly spreading flames grew louder, more menacing. One of the arsonists lunged, trying to block their only path to escape his face, a grotesque mask in the flickering firelight. But Henry, surprisingly agile for his weakened condition, swung a heavy piece of broken shelving he'd noticed earlier, connecting solidly with the man's shin. The man howled in pain and surprise, stumbling back. Emily spotted a small boarded-up window high on the back wall of the shed. It was their only chance. "There!" she screamed over the roar of the fire. She threw herself at it, pounding with her fists, then grabbing a loose brick she dislodged from the floor and smashing it against the rotting wood. Splinters flew. The opening was tiny, barely large enough for a child, let alone a grown man, but maybe, just maybe. Go, Henry. Go first, I'll be right behind you. She urged, her voice hoarse from the smoke. Smoke filled her lungs, each breath a searing agony. The roar of the fire was deafening, a hungry beast consuming their precarious refuge. Henry, coughing violently, his face blackened with soot, struggled towards the makeshift opening. The remaining arsonist, recovering from his companion's injury, was coming for them again, his face contorted in a snarl of murderous intent. Emily shoved Henry with all her strength. Push, you have to push. With a desperate, agonizing heave, he managed to squeeze his thin frame through the jagged opening, tumbling onto the dirt and gravel outside. Emily tried to follow, scrambling for purchase, but the man grabbed her ankle, his grip like an iron vise. She screamed, kicking frantically, her small nails clawing at his hand. His grip was relentless, determined. Suddenly, a siren wailed close this time. Not distant and ambiguous like before, but sharp, piercing, and rapidly approaching. The arsonist cursed, his grip momentarily slackening in surprise and alarm. Damn it. Someone must have seen the smoke or heard the commotion. Emily wrenched her leg free, scraping it badly against the rough wood, and scrambled desperately through the narrow opening just as the shed roof began to groan, ominously threatening to collapse. She landed hard beside Henry, coughing, soot covered her body, trembling. They could hear shouts, then the distinct, unmistakable wail of fire truck sirens drawing nearer, accompanied by the flashing blue and red lights of police cruisers. Their attackers, thwarted and fearing capture, had vanished into the concealing darkness of the night. Panting, bruised, and terrified, they watched as flames leaping high into the night sky consumed their temporary refuge. Mrs. Harper, it turned out, alerted by a vigilant neighbor who saw the smoke and flames billowing from the abandoned property, had wasted no time in calling the fire department and the police. It was another terrifyingly narrow escape, another profound debt owed to the growing, unspoken network of unlikely allies that was slowly forming around them. Mildred, her face etched with deep worry, and a steely resolve, bundled them into her old battered sedan under the chaotic cover of the fire response team's arrival. "You can't stay out here, not anymore," she said grimly, her voice firm. "They're not just trying to keep you quiet, Henry. They're trying to kill you. Both of you." At Mildred's small, immaculately kept house, a fragile sanctuary from the storm raging outside, Henry, recovering slowly from his fever and ordeal, watched Emily sleep fitfully on a makeshift bed on the sofa. A stray beam of early morning light, filtering through a gap in the curtains, highlighted a tiny dark mole at the corner of her left eye. A mole, just like Anna's. My Anna. The thought struck him with the force of a physical blow. A memory surfaced, sharp, vivid, and now unbearably painful. Victoria, shortly after they married, cooing over Anna, the daughter he'd raised as his own, after his beloved first wife, Eleanor's early tragic illness and untimely death. Victoria, her voice a silken caress that always managed to soothe his sharpest doubts, had said, "Look, Henry, my dear." A distinctive little mole right at the corner of her eye. Just like your first daughter Eleanor described. The one you always imagined you might have had with dear Eleanor, had she only lived longer to bless you with more children. It's as if fate itself wants you to see a part of her, a continuation in Anna too. Back then, lost in a fog of grief for Eleanor, and overwhelmed by Victoria's seemingly selfless, unwavering devotion to Anna, he'd dismissed fleeting, troubling incongruities, subtle differences in Anna's features that didn't quite align with what he remembered of Eleanor's distinct family traits. Victoria had always been there. A soothing voice, a patient, understanding smile, subtly reframing his perceptions, making his nascent doubts seem like the lingering tendrils of grief or unfair, unwarranted comparisons. "Don't torture yourself, darling," she would murmur, her hand resting gently on his arm. "Anna is a child of love. Our love. A gift to us both." now looking at Emily, this brave, resilient child, whose features held an undeniable, haunting echo, not of Eleanor, but of himself, of his own mother. A terrible, earth-shattering suspicion, long dormant, began to take root, unfurling like a poisonous vine in his mind. Why does she look so much like me? He murmured, his voice barely a breath. Emily stirred in her sleep, a small whimper escaping her lips. "Don't leave me." She mumbled the words laced with a child's profound fear of abandonment. Words that lanced his soul, tearing through the carefully constructed facade of his life. The next morning, a soft, hesitant knock at the front door. Mildred entered, her expression a mixture of sympathy and trepidation, accompanied by a small, tear-streaked girl clutching her coat sleeve, as if for dear life. "Sarah Caldwell," Mildred said gently, her voice low. "She ran away from the estate last night. Said she heard her mum talking on the phone, saying terrible things about you being locked away, that you were an embarrassment best forgotten." Henry's heart, already bruised and battered, fractured anew. "Sarah." He opened his arms, his own eyes welling with tears, and his younger daughter, his undisputed child with Victoria, flew into them, clinging to him with a desperate strength. "I heard Mum talking to Mr. Drake on the phone." Sarah sobbed into his shoulder, her small body trembling. She said the old problem was unfortunately still alive, and that the girl he was with was a complication that needed to be permanently resolved before things got out of hand. "I was so scared, Daddy, I didn't know what to do, so I ran to Mrs. Mildred's. I remembered you saying she was a kind lady." Holding Sarah tight, shielding her from the horrors he was only just beginning to comprehend. Henry's gaze drifted to Emily, still asleep on the sofa, to the mole, to the startling, undeniable resemblance to his own family, to that inexplicable, powerful pull he felt towards her. This child hadn't just saved his life. She felt like a missing piece of his very soul. He knew then, with a chilling, gut-wrenching certainty, that he had been living a carefully, meticulously constructed lie for years. Victoria hadn't just imprisoned him. She had stolen his entire past, his true legacy. "Mildred," he said, his voice raw with a dawning, terrible understanding. "I need an untraceable phone, and I need to find Louis Ortega. Immediately." Louis Ortega, a private investigator of considerable skill and discretion, with a past intertwined with Henry's more prosperous days, arrived looking like he'd wrestled a bear and barely won. His coat was rumpled, his face etched with fatigue, but his eyes behind slightly askew glasses were as sharp and penetrating as broken glass. "Jesus Christ, Henry. I thought you were 6 feet under and pushing up daisies," Ortega said bluntly, his usual gruffness softened by a clear shock. Henry, his voice tight with a dreadful burgeoning urgency, explained everything. The girl Emily, the box, the impossible, undeniable resemblance, the mole. "I need to know Louis. Was my whole life with Anna, with Victoria, a lie? And who in God's name is Emily Grace Ortega?" Listened, his expression growing grimmer with each unfolding detail. "Victoria was always ruthlessly ambitious, Henry, and possessive. When your first wife, Eleanor, died so suddenly, so conveniently, just after Anna's supposed birth, there were whispers hushed and quickly suppressed. Eleanor's attending physician, the one who signed the rather cursory death certificate, retired to an untraceable, lavish fortune in the Cayman Islands less than a month later. I looked into it briefly back then, a loose end for another unrelated client, but hit a solid brick wall, a wall lined with Caldwell money and considerable influence, Victoria's, I now realize, not yours, as she controlled the narrative even then. This was Ortega's new devastating twist, a revelation that suggested Victoria's deceptions ran deeper and may have started far earlier and with more sinister implications than Henry had ever dared to imagine. She hadn't just swapped babies. She might have orchestrated events to ensure Eleanor couldn't contest anything, couldn't reveal Victoria's barrenness or her intricate plans. The horrifying implication struck Henry like a physical blow. Had Victoria somehow hastened Eleanor's end? The thought was too monstrous, too unbearable to contemplate fully, yet it now festered in his mind. "Get me a DNA sample from Emily Ortega," said his voice softer now, pragmatic. "A hair, anything. I know someone trustworthy at St. Clair Hospital. We can run a quiet, off-the-books test." Henry approached Emily, who was now awake, watching him with those unnervingly perceptive eyes. With hands that trembled perceptibly, he gently plucked a single strand of tangled hair from her old, worn coat. "Forgive me, Emily," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I'm okay," she said softly, her gaze steady, filled with an understanding that belied her years. "You deserve the truth. We both do." 2 excruciatingly long days later, Ortega returned. The air in Mildred's small, cozy kitchen crackled with unbearable, almost palpable tension. He laid down a folded, official-looking document. Original birth records from St. Clair Hospital. 2 girls listed. Emily Grace, mother, initially listed as Jane Doe, then later overwritten clumsily with another fictitious name. And Anna Caldwell, mother, listed as Victoria Langford, though no record of her being admitted for childbirth could be found, only for postpartum observation, a day after Anna's recorded birth time. Same day of birth, Henry. Same hour. He paused, letting the information sink in. Emily's original mother's name, the one faintly discernible under the overwritten scrawl on the Jane Doe record, was Eleanor Vance. Your first wife, Henry. There's a faint hospital intake stamp from the maternity ward dated the day of Emily's birth, with Eleanor's name clearly legible next to an infant girl matching Emily's recorded birth weight and length. He then produced the DNA report, his hand steady as he passed it to Henry. "It's a 98% paternal match, Henry. Emily Grace is Emily Grace Caldwell, your biological daughter with Eleanor Vance." Henry stared at the stark, irrefutable words on the page, the letters blurring before his eyes, the world tilting on its axis. He looked at Emily, truly seeing her now. His child, his flesh and blood, stolen from him, abandoned. Yet who had, by some inexplicable, astonishing miracle, found her way back to him, had literally pulled him from his grave. He dropped to his knees, a ragged, heartbroken sob tearing from his chest, a cry not of grief, but of a profound, earth-shattering, agonizing release. He pulled Emily into his arms, holding her as if he would never let go. She froze for a heartbeat. Then her small, thin arms wrapped around him, a hug 12 long, stolen years overdue. Sarah, who had been watching from the doorway, with wide, uncertain eyes, ran to them, her small hands clasping theirs, tears streaming down her own face. "Now our family's bigger," she whispered, her innocent words a balm to Henry's ravaged soul. Ortega then delivered another, even more chilling blow. Anna's file, the paternal DNA marker section, is conspicuously absent, completely blank. Not inconclusive, just missing, as if deliberately erased. And that distinctive mole on Anna, the one Victoria made such a show of, my contact at St. Clair, a very discreet and skilled dermatologist, took a look at old infant photos Victoria occasionally released for PR purposes over the years. He says it's highly probable, almost certain, that Anna's mole was tattooed on her as an infant. A minute, almost undetectable, skillfully done speck of cosmetic ink. Victoria didn't just swap them, Henry. She engineered their superficial resemblance, callously marking another innocent child to maintain her monstrous, intricate lie about Anna being Eleanor's legacy and your biological child. The sheer, calculated, psychopathic cruelty of it left Henry speechless, nauseated. Victoria hadn't just stolen his true daughter. She had disfigured and manipulated another child, Anna, using her as a pawn in her grotesque, decades-long deception. Before a throng of flashing cameras and microphones at a hastily arranged chaotic press conference, Henry Caldwell, gaunt and visibly aged, but with a new steely resolve in his eyes, told his harrowing story to a stunned world. "I was never dead," he began, his voice trembling slightly at first, then growing stronger, fueled by righteous anger. "I was imprisoned, betrayed, and buried alive. By my wife, Victoria Langford Caldwell." He paused, letting the bombshell sink in, and then his voice rose, filled with a father's fierce, protective love. "And she stole my true daughter, my biological child, with my first wife, Eleanor Vance. A daughter named Emily Grace Caldwell, who by the grace of God and her own incredible courage found and saved me from that living tomb." The room erupted into a maelstrom of shouted questions and frantic scribbling. Federal agents and state police, armed with warrants based on Henry's initial testimony and Ortega's preliminary findings, raided the opulent Caldwell estate simultaneously. Victoria, surprisingly calm, almost serene, was apprehended and handcuffed in her silk dressing gown. Silas Drake, however, already sensing the inevitable collapse of Victoria's empire, was already singing bartering for his own survival. "Give me a reduced sentence, and I'll give you everything you need to bury her," he told the lead investigator. "Victoria is meticulous, pathologically so. She even had fail-safes against me contingency plans. She once mentioned a hidden ledger, a comprehensive list of everyone involved in her enterprises hidden somewhere only she knows. Something about insurance, if I ever got any foolish ideas about crossing her." This was Silas's desperate self-preservation twist. He wasn't just offering testimony against Victoria. He was hinting at a much larger, more complex conspiracy that she controlled a web of corruption with far-reaching tentacles. Daniel Voss, the Caldwell Corporation's slick head of communications, already feeling the heat, surrendered to the FBI later that day, armed with internal documents detailing financial irregularities and cover-ups. Dr. Felicia Tran, her loyalty to Henry unwavering, presented the damning DNA evidence and the meticulously documented fraudulent hospital records in an emergency court hearing. The evidence of the tattooed mole on Anna, corroborated by expert dermatological testimony, sent a fresh wave of shock and revulsion through the courtroom and the wider public. Lucinda Bell's carefully curated empire of lies and social standing crumbled into dust almost overnight, as her malicious fabrications were exposed. Deputy Carl Bridges, confronted with irrefutable evidence of suspicious financial transactions lining up with his dismissal of Emily, confessed his error in judgment. Julian Blake, tears streaming down his face, publicly admitted to deleting his crucial photos of Henry from years ago, confessing he'd been threatened and terrorized into silence. The net was closing, tightening around Victoria and her network of co-conspirators. But Victoria Langford Caldwell was not one to be cornered easily. She was a predator, and predators fight hardest when trapped. The trial was a media circus, a spectacle of wealth betrayal and almost unimaginable cruelty. Testimonies from a parade of witnesses painted Victoria as a narcissistic sociopath, a meticulous, cold-blooded puppeteer who manipulated everyone around her for her own gain. Yet through it all, she remained unnervingly, almost supernaturally composed, her gaze fixed, her expression serene. One afternoon, during a court recess, as Emily, Henry, and Sarah were leaving the heavily guarded courthouse under police escort, a black unmarked van screeched to a halt beside them, its side door flying open. Masked men moving with brutal efficiency leapt out. It was a brazen daylight abduction attempt, clearly orchestrated by Victoria from within her prison cells, a chilling demonstration of her continued reach and ruthlessness through loyal, handsomely paid operatives still at her command. Chaos erupted. Officers yelled, drawing their weapons. Henry, instincts overriding his weakened state, threw himself protectively in front of Emily and Sarah. One operative, quick and strong, grabbed Emily, trying to drag her towards the waiting van. She fought with the ferocity of a cornered wildcat, biting, kicking, screaming. Henry, his old wounds and recent trauma momentarily forgotten in the surge of paternal fury, wrestled with another assailant, buying precious, vital seconds. Sarah, terrified but brave, clung to his legs, screaming for help. Emily twisted violently in her captor's grasp, stomping down hard with her heel on his instep. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. That was all the opening she needed. She ducked under his arm, darting back towards the perceived safety of the courthouse steps, just as Louis Ortega, who had been observing the proceedings from a discreet distance, anticipating potential trouble, intervened, tackling the man, who was about to re-seize her, with the force of a linebacker. Uniformed police officers swarmed the remaining operatives, subduing them after a brief, brutal struggle. The attempt had failed, but it was a chilling, unambiguous message. Victoria still had power, still had influence, and would stop at nothing. Her composure in court the very next day was even more terrifying. She looked directly at Emily, a slow, deliberate smile playing on her lips, a smile that didn't reach her cold, reptilian eyes. "You can't keep what's mine." Her gaze seemed to scream across the courtroom, a silent, possessive vow. The prosecution, bolstered by this new blatant act of violence, an attempted kidnapping, pressed their case harder, painting Victoria not just as a master manipulator, but as an ongoing, imminent threat. Silas Drake, now fully cooperating and fearing for his own life should Victoria ever regain her freedom, revealed the location of a hidden, reinforced vault concealed behind a false wall in the master suite of the Caldwell estate. Inside, among damning financial records, incriminating audio tapes of Victoria coolly plotting Henry's abduction and discussing the baby swap with chilling detachment, was a small, unassuming, leather-bound ledger. Victoria's insurance policy. It meticulously detailed payments, names, dates, and services rendered, implicating not just those directly involved in Henry's captivity and the complex baby swap, but a sprawling web of corrupt officials, easily bought medical staff, and even a shadowy, powerful organization called Nova Genesis, which specialized in discrete identity solutions for wealthy, influential clients. The biggest, most shocking twist, buried deep within Victoria's meticulous, almost obsessive notes, Dr. Leonard Gresham, the distinguished silver-haired chairman of St. Clair Hospital's board of directors during the year of the fateful switch, was not just a passive recipient of generous bribes. He was, in fact, Victoria's silent, deeply compromised partner, the co-architect of the initial audacious baby-swapping scheme, driven by his own desperate, insatiable need to cover massive, crippling gambling debts that threatened to destroy his reputation and career. Victoria, ever the pragmatist, held irrefutable evidence of his significant crimes, which is why he had remained so loyal, so compliant for so many long years. The expertly tattooed mole on baby Anna. It was Dr. Gresham's private exclusive clinic that had performed the delicate procedure discreetly listed on internal records as a minor birthmark correction and removal. The ledger also chillingly revealed that Julian Blake's near-fatal car crash all those years ago had been a calculated intimidation tactic ordered by Victoria through Gresham's less savory contacts. Julian, it turned out, had inadvertently photographed Henry meeting with Eleanor's estranged but concerned brother shortly before Eleanor's sudden death. A meeting Victoria feared could expose her subtle, insidious manipulations of Henry's understanding of Eleanor's declining health and her own carefully constructed image as a loving caregiver. The jury, confronted with this overwhelming mountain of evidence, returned with a swift, unanimous verdict: guilty on all counts. Victoria Langford Caldwell, her mask of serene composure finally cracking to reveal a flicker of shocked disbelief, was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Silas Drake, for his extensive cooperation, received a substantially reduced sentence. Dr. Leonard Gresham, exposed and disgraced, was arrested shortly after the verdict, his empire of deceit crumbling around him. 1 month later, at the sprawling Caldwell farm, now beginning to feel like a true home. Filled with the hesitant sounds of healing and tentative laughter, Henry, Emily, and Sarah stood together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. Anna, removed from Victoria's toxic, suffocating influence, was thriving with a loving, carefully chosen foster family approved by Henry, and often visited her newfound half-sisters and father. Henry turned to Emily, his eyes filled with a profound, quiet emotion. He held out a small, worn, one-eyed teddy bear, its fur matted in places, its remaining button eye gazing up with a curious, ancient wisdom. This was yours, wasn't it, Emily, from before? I found it tucked away among Eleanor's personal things after she passed. Victoria must have taken it from your crib at the hospital, likely when she orchestrated the swap, and then discarded it with a box of Eleanor's belongings intended for charity. She then, years later, gave you a nearly identical new one at the orphanage, no doubt to create a false trail, a manufactured memory, if you ever started asking questions. I kept this one for some reason I could never explain. I always felt a strange, inexplicable connection to it, a sense of loss of something precious, misplaced. Emily took the proffered bear, her small hands trembling. Tears, hot and silent, streamed down her face. It was the bear, the one from her faded, fragmented orphanage memories, the one she had always instinctively known was her true first companion, not the slightly newer, less worn one she had carried in her shopping cart through the desolate woods. Victoria's calculated, layered cruelty had known no bounds, extending even to the manipulation of a child's most cherished, innocent possessions. Together, their hands clasped, and they launched the Grace Foundation, its mission statement simple yet profound, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping homeless, abandoned, trafficked, and forgotten children. Where every child deserves to be called by name. Benji, a street kid Emily had once shared a precious threadbare blanket with under a cold, indifferent bridge, now adopted into a loving home and thriving in school, became one of the Foundation's earliest, most passionate volunteers. Years passed. The Grace Foundation grew its reach, expanding a beacon of hope in a world that too often looked away. Emily, no longer a lost, invisible child, but a calm, intelligent, deeply empathetic young woman, became its driving force, its compassionate heart. One cool autumn evening, as a young girl, tattered, lost, and mirroring Emily's own haunted past, arrived at their gates hesitant and afraid, Emily opened the door herself. Her eyes, filled with a profound, lived understanding, met the girls. "You've come to the right place," she said, her voice a quiet, unwavering promise. 7 years after Victoria's conviction and life sentence, Mason Drake Silas's estranged, guilt-ridden younger brother emerged from the shadows he had inhabited for over a decade. He had been a senior security specialist at Caldwell Corporation, complicit in the early stages of covering up Emily's existence, staging a minor, easily overlooked administrative error, and a subsequent small contained fire at the orphanage to lose her records permanently. Haunted by his actions and the ever-present fear of Victoria's lingering reach, he presented Emily with further irrefutable evidence: Nurse Rosemary's personal detailed journal. Rosemary, the compassionate nurse who had cared for both Emily and Anna as newborns at St. Clair, had fiercely opposed the switch, had tried to alert hospital authorities and even Child Protective Services, and was systematically, cruelly discredited. Her career ruined, effectively driven out of medicine by Victoria and the complicit Dr. Gresham. Her last heartbreaking journal entry read, "I couldn't save little Emily, that precious stolen child. They were too powerful, too ruthless. But I believe with all my heart that one day she will save herself. And in doing so, she will save many, many others." The journal detailed not just Emily's horrifying swap, but contained meticulously recorded hints of other irregularities at St. Clair. Other Jane Does, whose babies vanished without a trace into a corrupt, exploitative system facilitated by the shadowy tendrils of novogenesis. The fight, Emily realized with a chilling certainty, was far bigger than just Victoria Caldwell. It was a systemic network, a cancer preying on the vulnerable. The Grace Foundation, under Emily's determined leadership, launched the Emily Project, a national initiative, and then the Mother's Name Project, dedicated to unraveling the tangled, deliberately obscured web of stolen identities across multiple states. Their painstaking work led directly to the exposure and eventual dismantling of novogenesis and played a crucial role in the landmark passage of the Child Identity Protection Act by Congress. 15 years after that fateful day, she found Henry buried in the woods. Emily Grace Caldwell stood before the gleaming, newly constructed Grace Alliance Network headquarters in Washington, D.C., a testament to her unwavering dedication. Henry, now frail but his eyes alight with immense pride, watched her address the assembled crowd of supporters, survivors, and policymakers. "I once thought I had built an empire of bricks and mortar," he whispered to Sarah, who stood beside his wheelchair. "But you, Emily, my dear brave daughter, you have built a world worth living in a world of hope and healing." Later that night, alone in her quiet office, Emily held her 2 teddy bears. The one from the orphanage, a bittersweet symbol of her lost, stolen childhood, and the one Henry had miraculously saved from Eleanor's belongings, a tangible symbol of her reclaimed past, her true lineage. An intern at the foundation herself, once a child, Emily's organization had rescued from the streets, looked at her with awe. "Miss Emily," she asked softly, "how did you do it after everything you went through? How did you never ever give up?" Emily smiled, a look of profound peace, acceptance, and unwavering resolve in her eyes. "Because once when I was utterly lost, invisible to the world, someone finally saw me. And because love," Emily learned, no matter how deeply buried or cruelly betrayed, always finds its way home. Every child, every single one, deserves to be found, to be named, to be loved for who they truly are. The world, for so long a place of desolate shadows and crushing indifference for Emily Grace Caldwell, was now illuminated by the countless bright, unwavering lights she had helped to shine, each one a story of hope, rekindled a life, reclaimed a profound and lasting testament to the homeless girl who saved a millionaire, and in doing so not only found herself, but changed the world one stolen name at a time. And sometimes, if you listened closely on a quiet night at the original Grace Foundation farm, now a National Heritage Site, you could almost hear the wind whispering through the ancient Harrison woods, not of decay and forgotten things, but of new beginnings of resilience and of the enduring, unbreakable power of grace.